Hello, my name is Matt Faust. I'm a fisheries biologist with the Ohio Division of Wildlife, and I work on Lake Erie at the Sandusky Fisheries Research Station. Today I'll be talking about some of the acoustic telemetry research that I've been involved with that's aimed at informing fisheries management by understanding where walleye move within Lake Erie. My talk today will be composed of 4 parts, and I'll start by first talking about how walleye are managed within Lake Erie. Walleye are an incredibly popular species of fish to harvest on Lake Erie. This is a figure showing total harvest from the lake's commercial and recreational fisheries over the last 40 plus years. And this consistent levels of large numbers of fish harvested each year has earned Lake Erie the nickname the walleye capital of the world. And it's a culturally important fish. This is a photo of Willie the walleye, which on New Year's Eve is dropped instead of the ball in Times Square in Port Clinton, Ohio to ring in the new year. And as such, sustainable management is critical in keeping the health of the population up to support these fisheries. Underpinning that sustainability is the foundation of cooperative fisheries management around Lake Erie. There are 5 different jurisdictions around the lake, 4 different states, and the province of Ontario. And each of those agencies works collaboratively together to sustainably manage the fishery on an annual basis. As an example of the types of data that are collected each year in support of that sustainable management, I'll walk through what data are collected within the state of Ohio. On the population side, we conduct annual bottom trawl surveys that help us get an idea of how many young fish have hatched each year. Gill netting, which provides us an index of the adult walleye population size and age structure, and electrofishing during the spring in support of our fisheries assessment. There's not currently a commercial fishery for walleye in Ohio. That was bought out several decades ago. However, there are commercial harvest and effort monitoring that goes on in the state or in the province of Ontario, which has a large commercial fishery. And within Ohio, there's a large recreational harvest from our sport fishery, and we monitor the total harvest and effort each year. At the end of each field season, biologists from each of the 5 jurisdictions get together and pool the data that they've collected from those population surveys and the harvest and effort information that's been obtained from each of the fisheries. And we pull that data in a statistical catch at age model, which is referred to here as a task group model, that ultimately provides a population estimate for the adult walleye population within Lake Erie. That information is provided to the Lake Erie Committee, a group of senior fisheries managers from each jurisdiction, who ultimately determine what the total allowable catch or the total number of walleye that can be removed from Lake Erie in any given year, which then trickles down to each jurisdiction's total allowable catch or harvest quota, which then finally is used by each individual agency to set a harvest quota or a daily bag limit. In addition to all of the annual assessment work that each agency conducts, research also plays a key role in sustainably managing Lake Erie's walleye fisheries. This is an example of the different partners that the Division of Wildlife works with on an annual basis. And through targeted research projects undertaken with each of these partners, we're continually working to improve our understanding of fish ecology and to update the management tools at our disposal. Now that I've gone over how walleye are managed and the role that both annual assessment and targeted research play, I'll talk a little bit more about why we care about where walleye move within the lake and how that pertains to management. We saw earlier that there are a number of different states and the province of Ontario that border Lake Erie. And it's important to note that within each of those different areas, there are different fisheries that exist. For example, in the province of Ontario, there's a large commercial fishery targeting perch and walleye. However, on the US side, no such commercial fishery exists, and in its place, there is a large recreational fishery, the largest of which resides within the state of Ohio. And it's important to know where walleye move because they don't necessarily respect or understand what a state or even an international border is, and understanding those movements throughout the lake are important to management decisions. This figure is showing how the different fisheries in the different areas relate to the total number of walleye harvested within Lake Erie. And so the darker green shades indicate higher levels of harvest. And as you can see, the darker areas are in the western part of the lake for both the commercial fishery in Canadian waters and the sport fishery on the US side in Ohio. And as you move into the central and eastern basins of the Lake Erie, those shades of green kind of lighten up, corresponding to lower levels of harvest, whether it be from the sport fishery or the commercial fishery, as you get into those more easterly parts of the lake. And this is important to note that as the walleye are moving throughout the lake, their chances of being harvested by these different fisheries is variable. And understanding how that variability may impact harvest from year to year is important to consider when making management decisions. It didn't take fisheries biologists long to realize that walleye were not a sedentary fish, and they undertook several studies to better understand when and where walleye were moving throughout Lake Erie. And these early tagging efforts used a conventional tag known as a jaw tag, which is a small metal band seen here that was affixed to the fish's jaw. And because these were relatively cheap to purchase, talking pennies for each fish, it allowed biologists to tag thousands of fish within any given year and understand where the fish were moving throughout the lake. And Lake Erie's jaw tagging program early studies began in the 1950s, but the most serious effort began in the late 1980s and ran through the early 2000s. And over the course of this, hundreds of thousands of walleye were tagged. This figure shows some of the results from that jaw tagging study, where each red dot on this map indicates the location for where a walleye that was tagged with a jaw tag in Lake Erie's western basin was subsequently recaptured either by the sport fishery or the commercial fishery. And you can see that these red dots are located throughout Lake Erie, not only in the western basin, but the central and eastern basin as well, but also moving north into the Detroit River, Lake St. Clair River, and Saginaw Bay and southern Lake Huron as well. So over the course of the jaw tagging study, what did we learn? We found out that these western basin spawning populations were highly mobile, moving throughout Lake Erie with a general tendency to migrate toward the east and even into Lake Huron. And that migratory tendency tended to be greater for larger, older females relative to their male counterparts. However, in any given scientific study, it's also important to ask, what did we not learn? And in the case of the jaw tags, these tags only provided two data points, point A being, for example, where the fish was tagged, and point B, where the fish was recaptured some year or some period of time later. And so because you only have those two data points, you don't really know much about the timing of those movements and the consistency between years, because it could be days, weeks, months, or several years or decades in between when a fish was tagged and when it was subsequently harvested and reported. And so you don't really know much about what was going on in between those two data points. For the next part of my talk, I'm going to focus on how we've used acoustic telemetry to try and understand and answer some of those unknown questions that we weren't really able to get at using the jaw tags. More modern studies focused on understanding walleye movement have used acoustic telemetry, which relies on both receivers and acoustic transmitters to follow the fish's movement. Acoustic transmitters are electronic tags that emit an acoustic signal every 2 to 3 minutes on average that provide a unique tag identification for each tagged fish. And as the fish are swimming around throughout Lake Erie and the tag emits that signal is heard and logged by acoustic receivers that then record the date and time that each tagged fish was in the vicinity of the receiver. Over the next couple of slides, I'll show how we implant the acoustic transmitters into walleye and what the receivers actually look like as they're out in the lake. The acoustic transmitters must be surgically implanted into the body cavity of fish that are captured typically via electrofishing or short set gill nets to minimize the capture stress on the fish. This video will show the process and setup for surgically implanting walleye with acoustic transmitters. So this is our setup where we're able to record all of the information throughout the surgical process. Fish are captured and held in large tanks that provide them with fresh water so that they're happy throughout the holding process. They're brought over to a measuring board where we take their length, and in addition to the acoustic transmitter, we put in a pit tag. This is like a microchip that you might get for your dog or pet. In addition to the acoustic transmitter, they also get an external tag so that if they're harvested, folks know that there's an acoustic tag inside. This fish is getting sedated using electricity so that it doesn't flop when we're operating on the fish, so that the fish isn't causing harm to itself once I've made the small incision. So here you can see me operating on this particular walleye and make a small incision on the fish's belly. This is the acoustic transmitter actually going inside the fish. So the tags are about the size of a tube of chapstick. The tag gets inserted, and then each fish gets 2 to 3 stitches. All the while it's getting fresh water pumped over its gills so that it's able to breathe and stays as happy as it can be throughout the surgical process. If I'm doing my job as a surgeon, each surgery can take as short as about 90 seconds, but usually it's 2 to 3 minutes on average. After the surgery is complete, they go into these recovery coolers, and after a few minutes, they're generally released unharmed back into the water. Here's one swimming off right now. Once the walleye are tagged and released, we rely on a system of acoustic receivers to detect each fish. Each receiver has a variable detection range that depends on basically the noise of the ambient environment. So on days where it's flat and calm, we're able to detect the fish from further out, whereas on days where it's blowing quite loudly, our detection range might be greatly reduced. And so as the fish swim within range of our acoustic receivers, the tag goes off and transmits the date and time along with that fish's ID. And some of the more expensive tags can actually provide us the fish's swimming depth and the temperature that it's occupying, or the temperature of the fish's body cavity. And then in order to get the detection data back from the receivers, we have to physically go out and retrieve them. And so we'll drive to the location where the receivers are, we'll send in a signal down to the receiver, and then that will pop to the surface if everything goes well, and we scoop it up and are able to download our detection data from the previous year or so. Here you'll see an acoustic receiver and its release being deployed out in Lake Erie. So it gets lowered down to the bottom of the lake, and then you'll see some underwater footage of just an example of an acoustic receiver sitting on the bottom with an anchor. You can see it floating there. The black part at the top is the acoustic release, listening for tagged fish. And then we'll pull up, send a signal down to the release, and then that will pop free from the anchor. The release and acoustic receiver float to the surface. We're watching for that as it comes up, and then we drive up and recover each receiver, and then are able to download it and upload all of the detection data to a large database. Within the Great Lakes, there are a network of researchers, fisheries biologists, and just folks in general that are using acoustic telemetry to study fish movement. And those researchers have organized under Glados, or the Great Lakes Acoustic Telemetry Observation System. And Glados helps to maintain these cooperative networks of acoustic receivers that allow us to track our fish movement through time. This animation shows the growth of Glados over the last decade. And basically each dot here is the deployment of an acoustic receiver throughout the Great Lakes. And as this progresses, you'll notice that not only the partnerships grow, of participating organizations, but Lake Erie starts to really fill in. And basically, if you're a tagged fish in Lake Erie, you can't swim anywhere without being detected by one of our acoustic receivers. And so Lake Erie has really, really good coverage and allows us to study the movement of our tagged walleye with really fine resolution. Since 2011, walleye have been tagged on a number of different spawning populations in relation to a number of different projects throughout the lake. In 2011, the first project tagged walleye in the Maumee River and in the Tittabawassee River, a tributary to Saginaw Bay and Lake Huron, to understand fish movement between Lakes Huron and Erie. After that, we started tagging walleye on Ohio's Reef Complex in the West Basin, and then in the Detroit and Sandusky rivers, and then the Grand River and several reef spawning populations in New York waters of the Eastern Basin, and then in Pennsylvania most recently. So between all of those projects, we've tagged well over 2,000 walleye, and the project objectives for each of those largely fall within the points below. For example, looking at within lake movement, so where do the fish that are tagged within Lake Erie go? Do the West Basin fish move to the East Basin and vice versa? And also between lake movement, so fish that are tagged in Lake Erie, do they move north into Lake Huron at any point? We've been able to look at their habitat selection, so what's the depth of the water that they're using or the temperatures within the water column. We're starting to look at mortality rates of the tagged fish. Spawning site fidelity rate, so what that means is because most of these fish are tagged during the spring on reefs or in the rivers where they're actively spawning, do the tagged fish come back to the spots where they're tagged year after year? And then also looking at harvest composition, so tagging the fish outside of the spawning period and see where they're going to spawn in following years. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on what have we learned from these few thousand fish that we've tagged. So let's first take a look at movement of tagged walleye between Lakes Huron and Lake Erie. This animation is showing movement of fish tagged in the Maumee River in the western basin of Lake Erie and the Tittabawassee River, a tributary to Saginaw Bay and Lake Huron. This animation shows their respective movement over the course of a couple of years of one of the very first studies looking at walleye movement using acoustic telemetry. And while you see their movement north and south from their respective spawning locations, there wasn't a whole lot of intermixing between the two populations. And over the course of the study, less than 1% of the tagged fish moved between lakes. And while less than 1% doesn't seem like that large of a number, when you think about how many millions of walleye are out in Lake Erie in any given year, that less than 1% could translate in numbers of fish anywhere from 250,000 to upwards of 1 million walleye in any given year moving north. Let's next take a look at movement of walleye tagged in the western basin of Lake Erie from the 4 spawning populations circled in red: the Detroit River, the Maumee River, the Sandusky River, and Ohio's open water reef complex. The blue dots show the tagged fish, and the black dots are the locations of acoustic receivers listening for the tagged fish throughout the lake. You'll see both the fish moving around and the locations of the acoustic receivers shift as we move through this animation, which covers a period of about 1 year from spawning season in April 2016 through March of 2017 the following year. And as you're watching the fish move around, keep in mind the key questions that we're trying to answer by tagging all of these fish. Those are Western Basin walleye a shared resource? When they move outside of the Central Basin, where and when are they within the Eastern Basin? And do the fish that are tagged on these different spawning populations go home to spawn each year? And as you're watching the animation for that final question, you do see that a lot of the fish do indeed go back to the Western Basin, which is their home, at least where they were tagged. On the flip side, this animation will take a look at movement of walleye tagged in Lake Erie's Eastern Basin, where some of those same questions exist. So are they a shared resource? Are they in the Western or in the Eastern Basin at the same time and in the same spots as tagged fish from the Western Basin? and did they go home to the spawning locations where they were tagged each spring. So this is the animation taking place over the same time, and in contrast to that Western Basin animation, you're not seeing nearly as much lake-wide movement from these Eastern Basin fish as we did from the walleye that we tagged in the Western Basin. So these East Basin fish are much more homebodies, and although they do move throughout the Eastern Basin, they tended to be in that part of the lake rather than swimming into Ohio waters or Michigan waters on the west end. Over the course of the next few slides, I'll show a few different highlights showing the diversity of different behaviors that we have seen from these tagged fish. This first one is a 24.5-inch male that was tagged on the Ohio reefs, and this is what I've dubbed the long distance traveler, where this fish consistently moved fast, traveling more than 200 miles in 20 days each year, and this fish does go home to spawn on the reefs where we tagged him back in 2014. And so this is the second summer after tagging, going back down to the Eastern Basin again. And then as we get later in the year, he starts making his way back to spawn, and then before ultimately moving back down into the Eastern Basin when he was ultimately harvested. In contrast to that long distance traveler that we saw in the previous slide, here's an example of a 28-inch female walleye that was tagged on those same reefs as that male that was more or less a homebody. This fish never moved more than 40 miles, or it was never detected more than 40 miles from its home. So that reef where we tagged it, and this was repeated over several spawning years, or several years of data, basically tagged in 2013, and the animation ends roughly 4 years later. And that fish was largely a Western or Western Central Basin walleye throughout the course of that tag's life. Finally, here's an example of a walleye that was tagged in the Grand River, Ontario. This was a 28-inch female, and she was a social butterfly. She was tagged in 2015, and this fish, as it was exploring the lake, never returned home and was consistently detected visiting other spawning populations throughout the lake. So as it moves into springtime the year after tagging, we detected her around the Ohio reefs in the West Basin before moving to the offshore part of the Grand River, and then spending time in Buffalo Harbor or New York, and actually moving back west later in the time series for this fish's detections. This is an example of a fish that probably makes geneticists scratch their head, where most of the fish are detected going back to their tagging location year after year after year. But it doesn't take very many examples of fish like this to really muddy the waters in terms of each spawning population's genetic signature. Last but not least, I wanted to show this example of a fish that I call Evel Knievel. This is a 23-inch male from the Sandusky River who was tagged in 2014, and as you'll see, he never gets a chance to return home. So this fish, after it's tagged, makes its way pretty quickly down to the Eastern Basin and spends time down there. It's detected around Buffalo, swimming around early June 2015. This fish clearly didn't return home in the 2015 spawning period, but as it's swimming around in the East Basin, it eventually makes its way into the Niagara River, where it's detected presumably alive in the upper stretches, and then making its way over Niagara Falls and eventually likely dead in the lower parts of the Niagara River. So what else have we learned beyond the fact that some walleye go over Niagara Falls? We've used the detection data that we've gotten back from some of these fish to examine their swimming depth in relation to their availability to our survey gears that are used each fall to index their size and age distribution. We've looked at spawning behavior of male and female walleye around Ohio's reef complex and how the different behavior of males and females relates to differences that we see each year in our spring sport fishery harvest. And finally, we've been able to look at how seasonal habitat use differences among the spawning populations in the western and eastern basins vary, and how that seasonal habitat use relates to some fisheries management decisions. So how might all of these data be used? The Walleye Task Group has several long-standing charges that include estimation of natural mortality, how we might incorporate the lake's eastern basin spawning populations into a single management plan, and also trying to coordinate lake-wide tagging efforts after the jaw tagging project was discontinued about a decade ago. And so all of the data from the ongoing acoustic tagging projects provide data to directly inform potential revisions to the Lake Erie Committee's next walleye management plan. Finally, I want to wrap up by talking about some unexpected benefits from all of the walleye tagging that's gone on over the last 10 years. An important part to any science project is the outreach and education component to it, and our tagging efforts on Lake Erie are no different, and we routinely interact with anglers and commercial fishers. This includes presentations like the one that I'm giving today to talk about what we're finding and why we're studying it. There's been a number of news articles written about the various tagging projects throughout the lake. There's been TV shows. The picture on the bottom left here is some colleagues from New York on an outdoor news show, and I was fortunate enough to be featured on the Aqua Kids show a few years ago talking about acoustic telemetry. We've been on podcasts, and probably most commonly taking phone calls from anglers that have harvested one of the tagged walleye, and each one of these is a conversation about how and why we tag these fish and why we do what we're doing. There's also a few instances where working collaboratively with some stakeholders has actually enabled us to tag large numbers of fish. An example of this is trying to tag walleye after the spawning period in the western basin, where my goal was to try and understand what spawning populations are harvested by recreational and commercial fisheries within Lake Erie, where natural markers, things such as genetic signatures from harvested fish, don't quite provide us the resolution that we were hoping for, where we wanted to go out, tag fish, and see where they spawned in following years. However, that required us to catch and tag large numbers of fish during a relatively short period of time. And while I'm certainly a professional walleye biologist, I will be the first to admit that I am not a professional walleye angler. This led me to contact the Lake Erie Charter Boat Association, and in particular, Captain Paul Pachowski on the left and the late Captain Dave Spangler on the right. They were very eager to help and were very, very excited about the possibility of working to help capture and tag large numbers of walleye for an acoustic tagging project. By working with volunteers from the LECBA during 2017 to 2019 and again in 2021, we spent roughly 20 days on the water with 10 different charter boats to tag nearly 600 walleye. That vessel time and crew were donated as in-kind contributions valued around $10,000, and without their donations, this project simply would not have been possible. You'll have to stay tuned for the results for this project, as I'm still working to analyze these data. Through that collaboration with the LECBA charter captains allowed me to tag plenty of fish to hopefully accomplish my research objectives, while simultaneously building upon existing relationships with the LECBA. So what that means is that I continue to provide or take multiple or annual meetings with the Lake Erie Charter Boat Association members at their monthly or bi-monthly meetings, and then annual updates at Ohio's Sea Grant Charter Captains Conference each year. In summary, we've learned that walleye are a shared resource throughout Lake Erie, and the walleye movements throughout the different jurisdictions help to support important commercial and recreational fisheries for each of these jurisdictions. By using modern methods to study walleye movement via acoustic telemetry, that has provided knowledge of walleye movement at previously impossible scales to directly inform management. And finally, collaboration and communication have been and continues to be keys to these projects' successes. Thank you for listening to my talk today.